1:30, so I'm going to go ahead and get going here. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to YCR's Food for Thought series. For those of you who are just seeing YCR for the first time, we are an advocacy group made by students and young professionals for students and young professionals. We believe that Canada can have a strong future in resources, the economy, and the environment. Please connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All of them are at YC Resources if you want to learn more about what we do. In addition, please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box below. Today, we have a panel of 3 young Canadians, Lily, Camila, and myself, to discuss the just transition movement within Canada. To give a bit of context, my name is Hannah, and I'm a third-year student at U of C in natural science. I've been with YCR for coming up on 2 years now, which is crazy. Just before we get going, I'd like to give a bit of background on what the just transition is. The just transition looks to prepare the workforce to participate in a low carbon economy. The goal is to minimize the impacts of changes to the labor market. In order to minimize the impacts to the workforce and provide inclusive economic opportunities for communities that may be affected by industry changes, there are 5 key areas of focus. These are disaster resilience, health and well-being, nature and biodiversity, infrastructure, and economy and workers. The basis behind the just transition is that the perspectives of workers are taken into account and that no one individual should feel disproportionate effects. This means that workers would have access to jobs of equal quality within their communities. At YCR, we agree that as Canada moves towards a lower carbon economy, that the perspectives of industry workers need to be taken into account. In saying that, we're all young people here. We're not experts, and while we have spent a lot of time researching this topic, our opinions are ever changing and we're learning every day. Our opinions are not all encompassing, so if you have any questions or comments or sources that you would like to share, please feel free to send them along. We would love to learn more. With that in mind, I would like to share the floor with my fellow speakers, and I'll pass it over to Lily now.
Thank you, Hannah. So I will introduce myself first. So my name is Lily Peterson, and I attended St. Polytechnic until 2018. I've been working with Young Canadians for Resources for approximately a year. I started spring of last year, so almost there. I'm a band member of the Cowessess Nation, which is Treaty 4 in Saskatchewan, although I was born in Banff, Alberta, which led to a long and fruitful journey of Indigenous resource advocacy for responsible resource development. I'm glad to be here today, and I will be sharing my viewpoint on the just transition policy and how this can affect Indigenous communities, but also to learn about different perspectives as well. I also want to preface this by saying I am not an expert, so I've chosen to use examples from Indigenous leaders, which I can provide sources for as well. So just to get right into it, decarbonizing our future has become a huge goal for many people in the coming years. And my understanding is that we as Canadians, of course, want to move forward to a greener future and a lower carbon economy. We all share the same environmental goals, and as a young Canadian, I would want those who are being affected to be consulted and considered as a main component. I hope that I can bring some insight into how Indigenous communities will be affected by the just transition and how it can either help or hinder both on and off reserve communities. We want to make sure that while we are trying not to hurt people in the future and move forwards towards a lower carbon future, we are also not hurting those who will be affected by the changes right now in the present. So we must not leave anyone behind. The policy not only affects Indigenous resource workers, but also affects those workers on reserve as well. For example, an article I read by Dale Swampy, who is from the Samson Cree Nation, and he's also the president of the National Coalition of Chiefs, expressed that it, meaning the policy, makes no mention of the effects that it will have on the impoverished in this country, who include 70% of our members living on reserve. Many will be unable to pay the high cost of utilities and energy that will follow from the plan. And so my understanding is that it is hard to tell a community that has spent generations trying to get out of poverty and creating their own equity that they are suddenly out of time and must move forwards to a renewable energy immediately. Simply not fair. Also, according to a report by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Indigenous women earn 3 to 4 times more in wages from occupation in oil and gas than from median wages across all industries. To help workers, both female and male, move forward towards a lower carbon economy, there must be no detrimental loss of wages that affect these people and their families and their communities as a whole. Creating an accessible, gradual future for these communities is much more feasible, all while reducing carbon emissions. The people in these areas who are affected, who are in the actual area of where the transition is happening, are the people who must be consulted with. It cannot be led by people in an area that isn't impacted by the just transition policy, that won't have to face the challenges and the fears that Indigenous workers may be having about potentially losing their jobs, which also, helps support a healthy economy and obviously their livelihood. Cadmus Delorme said, just make sure that you are at the table, referring to Indigenous people, knowing your values and empowering specialists to help lead a project of this nature to what we know we are capable of. And he said this when referring to the $21 million Cowessess First Nations solar project, which is my reserve. And I agree with his statement. Indigenous people need to be at the table and considered when changes like this are happening. Canadians have to ensure that both Métis and First Nations workers are going to be able to find work in these new sectors. We are wondering if the transition or the transformation will be able to replicate oil and gas jobs that workers have spent learning, or will they learn an entirely new trade? Most people don't know that Indigenous workers earn on average 3 times as much in oil and gas compared with the average salary of all sectors, $143,459 versus the average of $47,596, which is a crazy number. And that's according to Statistics Canada. There needs to be a solid plan in place for job security within Indigenous communities and the transition towards the decarbonized future. Companies will need to make changes within themselves as well to adhere to policy standards within the net zero timeframe. We also want to address the language that's being used around the just transition and how we recognize how polarizing this language can be. My coworkers will expand on it as well, but I also just wanted to throw in a commentary about how the just transition is being perceived. We shouldn't use damaging words for people who this policy is actually trying to help, like our workforce. There's talk that the government may actually change the name considering how just transition is being perceived negatively. In saying that, it is absolutely possible that we as Canadians can move forward to transform ourselves towards a lower carbon economy and reduce emissions, once again, using the example of the solar project on my reserve. It can be done. We just can't have our fellow Canadians become polarized, ostracized, or left out because of the transformation. Whether they are Indigenous or non-Indigenous, we should all work towards a common goal. At Young Canadians for Resources, we believe that there are 3 main pillars that should be focused on, and I believe that also applies to this situation as well. Those pillars are people, planet, and prosperity. So as long as the people being affected are included, the planet is being taken care of in a responsible manner, and Canada prospers as a country as a whole, then we can work together to find a common ground which we can all agree on. And that's my piece. So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Lily. That was fantastic. To hop into my piece here and to give a bit more background as to who I am, I'm a born and raised Calgarian. I've grown up in an oil and gas-based community. By this, I mean that the majority of the people around me have worked in or are currently working in oil and gas fields. In 2014, Canada experienced an economic downturn, which tanked oil prices, inversely related there. Don't need to get into that. But at the time, I was in middle school and I watched friends and neighbors struggle immensely. The effects of such a major economic crisis were clear, even at that age. Houses in the surrounding areas built with hard-earned money could honestly not be given away. The booming residential builds dried up, leaving skeletons of homes that almost were, created a whole slew of issues, including black mold. And we were all waiting to see who's going to step up and take responsibility for the half-done and since abandoned jobs. To be honest, though, no one could really afford it, and it really turned into a bit of a ghost town. Most memorably, though, I watched neighbors lose their lifelong careers. These were folks that were roughly 10 years away from retirement, but not ready to be out of the job yet. The only solution for them was to sell the homes that they built themselves decades before at steeply discounted rates, move away, and start applying to entry-level jobs. What I experienced was on a small scale, and the local community has continued to wax and wane in the meantime. This may all seem a bit irrelevant, but it's a very real reality for resource communities. When moving towards a lower carbon economy, workers and communities need to be consulted. My story is just an example of what happens when jobs of equal value are not readily available. So what happens on a larger scale when a workforce collapses? To be quite frank, there are endless examples throughout North America, not only from just transitions, but in areas like Detroit, where jobs suddenly dried up and left the workforce with very limited or if any options for employment. Within Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador provides a very relevant example. The Northern Cod Adjustment and Recovery Program resulted in widespread disruption to the labor force and caused the local population to decline by about 10%. People just had to move away. They needed to find jobs, support their families, earn a living, and they couldn't find that within their province. A 2022 article discusses the consequences of the transition from coal in Alberta. In the report from the Auditor General of Canada, it was stated that the federal government offered employment insurance at 55% of their previous wage, insinuating that workers could expect to have their wages nearly halved. The workforce of roughly 1,100 dwindled to just over 300 from 2017 to 2021, but programs to transition displaced workers were delayed until 2019 before being paused again at the start of the pandemic. At the time of the release of the article, transition programs were still not addressed, so that was mid-2022. While over 21 coal-fired generating stations are to be phased out across 4 provinces, a notable change occurred in Parkland County. Between 2018 and 2022, it was estimated that the country had lost $127 million in value, with the potential for that to swell to as much as $1 billion. Just within Parkland County, more than 1,440 jobs were lost. This is certainly not to say that Canada should leave fossil fuels industries as is. It's imperative to find common ground between climate concerns and the well-being of people. Transitions do not need to shut down fossil fuel industries altogether, as efforts such as carbon capture and sequestration are imperative to achieve net zero goals. There's always room for improvement within industry, and it is our responsibility to take care of the environment. However, it is highly irresponsible to disproportionately burden workers who are being put out of the job as a result of government policy. Canadians are very willing to work hard to achieve environmental goals, but if it can't be at the cost of their well-being, their standard of living, or their livelihoods. We all want the same things in terms of protecting the environment, and it's right to be pushing for innovation and cleaner technology. However, it is wrong to demonize industries and the folks that have committed their lives to them. With that, I would like to pass the floor over to Camila to discuss a little bit more on the environmental side of things.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you, Lily, for your presentation as well. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Camila. I am born and raised in a small coastal town in Quebec, and I studied in environmental sciences at University of Sherbrooke. I am currently doing my master in environmental management and climate change. So because of my background, it will not surprise you that I understand the urgency of global warming, and because of that, I value efforts made to lower our emissions and to properly adapt to climate change. I joined YCR in December of last year because I also see how important it is to develop sustainability within our resources. Like my peers, I am not an expert on the subject. I am only a university student interested in the subject of climate change and sustainable resource development. So I want to first get started by saying that until very recently, I didn't know there was such a negative connotation with the term just transition, especially out west. And I get it now. Like, I get that hearing that term might feel like, oh, transitioning is such an easy task. Why don't you just do it? And hearing it like that feels infantilizing and unrealistic. So I understand the negative feelings about it. What I will say is that the true meaning of the concept is actually the opposite of that. In knowing that it's knowing that the transition away from CO2 emissions cannot be done just like that, and that justice and equality needs to be at the center of such transformation. If I was to add to my colleague's definition of the concept, I'd say that the just transition movement is trying to solve 2 problems at the same time. The first thing it is addressing is our need to evolve toward less emission-intensive resources. There is a certain urgency to global warming that pushes us to transition away from emissions-heavy resources, maybe sooner than what we would have done otherwise. This urgency comes from the fact that globally, our efforts to lower our emissions have not been sufficient enough as of yet. The serious need for an effective and quick transition also comes from the fact that global warming is a vicious cycle, meaning it's a problem that gets exponentially worse over time. For example, as it gets warmer, forest fires will become more frequent, meaning there will be less trees to capture carbon, and wood burning will also release CO2 into the atmosphere. The urgency to make enough efforts now before it gets even worse is why transforming emission-heavy sectors is important. The second thing a just transition is addressing is how to limit as much as possible the negative counter effects that this transformation will have. One of the first concerns is with job security and job quality, like mentioned by my peers. The Carbon Brief, which is an online journal specialized in climate change, says that the aim of a just transition is to ensure that workers do not get left behind as the world moves away from carbon-intensive practices. The main takeaway here is as we make changes to lower our emissions, we need to make sure the people affected by those changes are as involved as possible and suffer the least consequences as possible. There are many ways to bring justice in this transformation, one of which being transforming industries instead of taking them out completely. For example, green technologies can help make oil and gas less emission heavy by sustaining carbon capture projects. It's important to remind ourselves that when we talk about a just transition, we do not only speak about oil and gas, but also other resource sectors as well. For example, a just transition when it comes to agriculture would also mean transforming the industry by making it less emission heavy without taking it completely out. Another concern about possible impacts of a transformation is what will happen with communities and towns whose survival and prosperity are dependent on emission-heavy resources. This is a real threat. In Quebec, there were some mining towns who were thriving in the 90s, and when the mining companies left or went bankrupt basically overnight, we have seen those towns experience a slow and painful death. Those ghost towns in Quebec are a testimonial to what not to do when it comes to transition and transformation. If those towns had time and support to diversify their economy away from only mining through a transition that is just and equitable, I believe that they would have had a fair chance at thriving and could still be standing today. For me, this is why having a just and well thought out transformation is essential for the survival of resource-dependent communities. And I want to end by saying that I understand how this issue can be very polarizing, but we should not lose sight of the fact that we all have the same goal here. We all want to lower emissions. We all want the people to have quality jobs and bring them joy. And we all want to see local communities thrive. So we have core common values, and being able to find a common ground here is the only way to go further.
That's fantastic. So appreciate your thoughts and having your perspective from Quebec as well. It's a very nice personal touch.